The origins of Judaism, and for that matter, all religious traditions, are not at all what we think they are. Welcome, Bruchim Abbaim. I'm Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi. You have found Beit Virtuale, and I am thrilled to announce the publication, finally, after all this time, of my book, Gateways into Judaism, Volume 1, Origins. It is available on all Amazon stores worldwide. Links of a few of them down below. I want to put out this announcement video to allow you to learn a little bit about it, have some easy links, ask questions about what's in the book, or ask questions after you've read it, and begin a dialogue, which is exactly what this book is supposed to be, as well as what this channel is supposed to be. The most obvious misconception about this book is that it's going to be an introduction to Judaism book. It is not an intro to Judaism book. There are hundreds of incredibly well-written books of that sort that are out there. But by nature, an introduction to Judaism book is about what is Judaism. My book is why is Judaism. Most people outside of Judaism don't understand how tiny of a minority religion Judaism is. Roughly 0.2% of the world population is Jewish. And quite frankly, with the unique history of Judaism, it's a religion and a peoplehood that simply should no longer exist, but yet does. Why? Add on top of that most of us, and it's hard to hear, and it's a little bit painful, a little bit uncomfortable, have no idea what's actually in the Tanakh, and if you're coming from a Christian perspective, have no idea what's actually in the Old Testament, but yet really think we do, forcing ourselves to look at what the narrative actually is, and then why that narrative is that. Well, that's really what this is about. Or to put it slightly differently, our traditions are weirder than we can possibly imagine, and much, much more interesting. This is volume 1 of a 3-volume set. The other 2 volumes will only come out if you read these books and ask questions. The intention is to incorporate our curiosities and our dialogue into the next 2 volumes. Volume 2 is Jewish thought. Volume 3 is Jewish practice. So comment below, let me know when you've ordered and when you've read this book. Start asking me your questions. Start asking the things that you want to be in the next volumes, what you're curious about, the things that you want to hear this kind of treatment regarding. So once again, if you've made it this far, links down below. And I'm going to continue the video. I'm just going to go ahead and read the prologue to the book. So a little online, informal Beit Virtuale book reading for those of you who are curious, and you'll get a little bit of a sense of what's actually in there. So pour yourself a little glass of your favorite beverage, sit back, and let's enjoy ourselves for a bit. So here it is, paperback edition, hardcover behind me. It's available on Kindle as well. Audible version will be coming out in the next couple months, as well as the first translations. Gateways into Judaism, Volume 1, Origins. Prologue. Is there such a thing as divine intervention? The central theological divide between Orthodox Judaism and non-Orthodox Judaism is this very question. The reason I cannot accept Reform Judaism is that Reform Jews do not accept Matan Torah. Translation. Reform Jews do not accept the literal giving of Torah by a literal God on a literal mountain, in a literal story, in a literal time. I have been on the receiving end of this assertion enough times to have my answer down pat. I completely accept Matan Torah. I am deadly serious about it. There is no Judaism without revelation. I simply disagree with the nature of Matan Torah. Our sages teach that every verse of Torah has 4 interpretations, and each word has 70 meanings. Each verse in the Torah can be interpreted based on the clear meaning of the words, their meaning within specifically Jewish hermeneutics, their useful interpretive meaning, and the mystical, underlying, wordless structure that binds them all together and points us to the universal, unknowable unity of the eternal. So, why are the verses describing Matan Torah the exception? Why do I get to see the Garden of Eden as a metaphor for the psychological development of all humankind and enjoy friendly arguments with my Orthodox brothers and sisters, yet Matan Torah must be literal? There is a midrash that speaks of all Jews that ever were or ever would be being present at the revelation of Sinai. It is a lovely story, but if taken as a guide to understanding the nature of Matan Torah, it becomes theologically critical. How is it that all Jews that ever were and ever would be could be present at the giving and receiving of Torah? If the giving and receiving of Torah is something that is an ongoing, unifying process, there is no contradiction. Sinai is the external symbol that hints at the greater truth. The narrative of Sinai introduces the idea of a moment in history where the Hebrew people, along with the multitudes of others that had joined them in their flight from Pharaoh, stood together to accept the Torah that was about to be given and thus become Jews. But as a narrative instead of history, Sinai allows us to encapsulate something much more nebulous than divine intervention, divine inspiration. Unlike Christianity, Judaism has no credo. Judaism's primary modalities are dialogue and practice rather than obedience and belief. The only required article of faith in Judaism comes from the Shema, where, as we go to lie down at night and rise up in the morning, we affirm that God exists and that there is only one God. But, much like President Bill Clinton playing around with the meaning of the word is, we get to argue every point in the statement. Asserting that God exists and that there is only one also means I get to argue about the nature of God, the meaning of existence, and even the possibilities hinted in the term one. The JPS translation of the Torah, with Lord replaced by eternal, renders the Shema in Deuteronomy 6:4 as, "Hear, O Israel, the eternal is our God, the eternal alone." Due to the nature of the Hebrew language and its inexhaustible subtleties and hinted implications within its word roots, I would be perfectly comfortable translating the same Hebrew text as "work to internalize, all of you who take part in the process of divine revelation. We are ruled by the very laws that govern all of existence, and through this are part of a universal unity." The implication of telling a rabbi of a more progressive interpretation of Jewish legal and narrative tradition that they do not believe in Matan Torah is that they are simultaneously ignorant and unobservant. The sadder implication is that we are not authentic. Yet, as was teased in my translation of the Shema, the very word Israel is defined by the Torah itself as the one who strives or wrestles with God. As a member of Klal Yisrael, the people of Israel, and being Bnei Yisrael, part of the children of that original tribal inspiration, at the core linguistic level, the only thing that removes us from authenticity within our Jewish life is when we stop wrestling or striving. In reality, much like my answer regarding Matan Torah, I take Jewish knowledge and practice deadly seriously. But I don't do it because I imagine a literal voice calling out and a literal hand carving letters in stone at a literal point in history. Regarding observance, it may be easier to plant an anthropomorphic figure in my narrative in order to frighten people into obeying enough rules to create a cohesive society. Yet, I believe that Jewish ritual and practice speak for themselves regarding their underlying wisdom and do not require the fear of being smote by a literal hand. For so many, the observance of the Sabbath, for example, is seen as some sort of commanded burden, while at the same time we go to therapists who suggest our mental health is being daily affected by a failure to unplug from our social media or letting our JOBs take over every other moment of existence. Therapists are going to suggest that we undertake some sort of process that removes us from being constantly wired to our primary sources of stress, exactly as developing a Shabbat practice would bring about. Less politically correct and much more likely to provoke a response, we search after every fad diet to remove the last kilos and pounds added through our last lockdown pandemic, while the intentionality inherent in a system such as kashrut and the blessings that surround the joy and gratitude of eating, if taken seriously, will give us tools we need to make eating elevated. This may not address all the complexity of issues around this subject, and general statements can never cover all individual complexity, but when the issue primarily arises from programmed automatic behaviors, then kashrut is a potential pathway of awareness rather than an unconscious process of shoveling the lowest common denominator carbs into our mouths to shut out our anxieties. When those from outside of Judaism enter into dialogue with Jews regarding kashrut, the assumptions often run into some sort of pity for what is seen as silly restrictions, rather than an analogous pathway for any tool that helps us live better by becoming aware of our actions. The deeper you travel into allowing the rituals of Judaism to exist as the external symbols that point to internal realities, the less those sacred obligations of the tradition feel like a punishment from a parental figure, and the more they feel like being embraced by a universal presence. The 3 volumes of Gateways into Judaism, Origins, Thought, and Practice, are the result of years of trying to find a way of interpreting Judaism to address 2 specific needs. First, we have the spectrum of I don't believe in God Jews. These I have most encountered around the age 12, when they are studying for their bar or bat mitzvah and are trying to find a clever way to get out of all the work. Surely if the rabbi thinks I don't believe in God, they will throw me out of class as fast as they can. Never have they anticipated my question, can you please describe for me the God that you do not believe in? This seldom goes well in the first moment, as dialogue was not the purpose of the original provocation. But after a little help, if you say that you do not believe in something, then you have the responsibility of defining the object of rejection. We usually get to the point where some version of what I call the Santa Claus God appears. I reject the bearded dude on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel who is out to look over my shoulder and tell me whether I am naughty or nice. What a joy it is to tell them I don't believe in that God either. Judaism has rejected that God for quite some time, if not from pretty much the very beginning. The tragic versions of I don't believe in God Jews are the ones that were turned away in the past by a religious authority that did not have the patience to listen to their questions. Much of our narrative is patently absurd on the surface, and children and youth, when allowed, are often the first to point this out. At several of the synagogues in which I had the pleasure to serve, the directors of education and I worked together to create a rabbi's board. It was simply a small whiteboard in each classroom whose sole purpose was to capture any question that the teacher was uncomfortable answering. We worked with the religious school teachers upon encountering such a question to respond with redirection and affirmation. What a wonderful question for the rabbi's board. About once a month, we would schedule a time for me to come into each class and address everything from the nature of sin, or the soul, or free will in Judaism, or what it means that the parents of different youth practiced wildly different versions of Judaism. Isn't there a right way and a wrong way? Even though Judaism is predicated upon the dialogic, so many Jews have been lost to their own religious tradition because someone told them through word or action that they either did not have the right to question, which is within Judaism patently absurd, or that they were a bad person for daring to bring up such a question, which perhaps comes from a limited reading of the 4 children in the Passover Seder. You really do need to give people permission to have an expansive theology. And as an expansive theology seldom supports funding models based on tomorrow looking different than yesterday, not many religious leaders before the last decades have given their adherents permission to ask questions that could weaken the institutions birthed by that theology. Judaism contains within it all the mechanisms needed to have continuous, challenging, and healthy dialogue, yet somehow we are in every generation getting more and more unable to engage in heterodox thought and to elevate our disagreements. I have seen so many of these adult I do not believe in God Jews come back into dialogue with their ritual and narrative tradition by engaging in some holy disagreement and helping them to realize that I as well do not believe that we are praying to a version of Santa Claus with a black coat and a Brooklyn accent, although when telling Jewish jokes the accent is a win. Regarding the second moment of origin for these books, I have developed the stories, anecdotes, and teachings in 3 volumes as part of a year-long class that I've taught for over a decade called Gateways into Jewish Thought and Practice. In the class were everyone from potential conversion candidates to accepted conversion candidates to born Jews that realize that at some point we are all Jews by choice in the late modern. As membership in all organized religion drops in nearly every Western country, not religious quickly becomes the default ticked box for folks of all religious ancestry. Unless born into very specific situations, unlike in previous generations, it is much harder to find a reason to step into religion, and quite easy to find reasons to stay away. Although I will try not to speak for any other religion other than when it is necessary to understand a Jewish point via compare or contrast, Judaism should be a tradition where one is not required to check your brain at the door. This does not mean that we always succeed with this ideal, but it is an ideal nonetheless that I will argue has been carved into the stone tablets of our tradition as surely as if from the finger of an anthropomorphic God. Regarding those who have sought to convert to Judaism, I've become convinced that we in Jewish leadership need to challenge our dominant approach to our conversion instruction. By necessity, most conversion classes are modular. What is Shabbat? What does it mean to eat kosher? What is Yom Kippur, and what are we supposed to do, and what are we not allowed to do? Patterned much like the question asked by the wise child in the Passover Seder, this objective knowledge is critical, But when presented without understanding how society and dogma program underlying religious assumptions, all we're doing is adding a thin layer of veneer on a table that has already been built by our formative religions and ideologies. An alien anthropologist walking into synagogue on Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement, might be hard-pressed to accurately understand what they see. At some point, among the sea of white clothing, the melodies turn from mournful, intense to joyful, while the fringes on our four-cornered garments are gathered into a fist that taps against the chests of those praying, Ashabnu, Begadnu, Gazalnu, Dibarnu Dofi. We have trespassed, we have dealt treacherously, we have robbed, we have spoken slander. Later, the tapping continues in a long litany of offenses, spoken as well in the first-person plurals, so inclusive of bad thought and behavior that the question must be begged, how bad are these people? For the sin that we have committed against you under duress or willingly, by hard-heartedness, inadvertently, with our lips, with immorality, openly or secretly, and it goes on. If this anthropologist had had any previous exposure to other Western traditions, they might logically assume the tapping of the chest to be a type of self-flagellation. The behavior could easily be attributed to humans, fearful of a watchful deity, crying out their offenses against a higher law and praying to avoid the inevitable retribution for transgression. The rub, however, is that little of this interpretation pertains to contemporary Judaism. The problem is that spiritual and religious concepts translated into the vernacular take on the dominant meaning from the most dominant and populous religions that speak that language. This means that such words as sin, belief, and even God, all of which can have wildly variant connotations in different religions, inherit the dominant popular conception from the most dominant local religion. If you walk into that synagogue with the Christian concepts that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and the wages of sin is death, then the image of beating one's chest in a type of self-punishment seems appropriate. Yet the word translated as sin in the Yom Kippur liturgy, chet, speaks of an archer shooting at a target and missing the mark, rather than the type of taint that removes one from a relationship with God as is suggested in Romans. Regarding the flagellation, although there is an element of punishment, Hasidic masters speak of us knocking on our heart as if it was a door, wishing for it to become softer and receptive to the process of teshuvah, recognizing that we have harmed others with our actions and that it is our personal responsibility to make amends. The Eternal cannot forgive you for a sin against your fellow. Confessing, in this context, is not a preventative action from damnation, but rather a reminder that it is our duty to repair and strengthen our relationships. I had a member of a congregation in Europe once leave the congregation because I moved the basin with water that was used for washing hands before blessing the challah for Friday evening dinner. The tables had been set up at the far end of a social hall, while the basin with a large printed laminated A3 poster of the blessings for hand washing had been set up outside the entrance to the social hall. After Friday evening, Erev Shabbat services, we would make our way from the sanctuary, the Beit Knesset, across the uneven stones of the entry hall into the social hall. After making Kiddush, we would then rise, return to the entry hall, and queue up to wash our hands. The rub was that the average age of those attending was about 75, with a goodly number of octo- and nonagenarians on canes. The hollow clopping of walking sticks on the wood floor could barely pull dark comedy out of the torture. Several months of cringe later, I simply moved the cart with the basin and the laminated poster with the proper blessing to the wall stage right of the dinner tables. 10 literal minutes were removed in a bold instant from the process of getting from service to l'chaim, and I stood proudly at the banner of what I assumed to be wise leadership. A week later, 2 of the synagogue members were in emotional turmoil after the evening service, one crying visibly, and the other staring me down with a fit of shocking anger in her eyes while supporting her friend. That was the last I ever saw of the crying woman, and the times I tried to call and speak, I was met with a slammed telephone. For months, the events both bothered and baffled me until I met a colleague at a conference who had served for several years in the same community. His insight knocked me on the floor. Mrs. B converted from Catholicism about 30 years ago. You did not move the bowl and pitcher for hand washing. To her, you moved the sacral basin. Now, the first danger here in weaving conversion to Judaism into a work such as Gateways is that we will encounter immediately the deep prejudice that is experienced daily by Jews by choice across the world. According to the most orthodox version of Jewish law, halakha, that you can find, the definition of a Jew is one who is born of a Jewish mother or one that has converted according to Jewish law. Yet, despite the great sages involved in this ruling, I have heard the term fake Jew thrown around with the clear intention of tearing down more times than I care to count. So, in retelling a story such as Mrs. B in the Basin, the purpose is not to add to this prejudice. Quite frankly, as Christianity is still the dominant culture in most Western countries, I have met a frightening amount of born Jews who have similarly confused understandings of their own tradition based on growing up and hearing the language of religion from within the dominant Christian paradigm. Gateways seeks to reclaim the distinctly Jewish flavor of our own religious terms without needing them to be defined to satisfy another religion. Sadly, Mrs. B in the Basin, as well as the plethora of similar stories that I and my colleagues can relate, demonstrate the criticality of actively calling to consciousness the lexicon of religion that rests in our minds, consciously noting what we imagine and think when these words are evoked, and then with intentionality building a new foundation based on the uniquely Jewish understanding of festival, Sabbath, blessing, sin, revelation, forgiveness, love, neighbor, obligation, and, oh yes, God. So I am asking you to join me at the foot of a Sinai that I take quite seriously. But this Sinai is a place where we get to argue and disagree without fear. By necessity, much of the tone of this book sets me up as the expert, which will be uncomfortable to many. In the larger scheme of Jewish knowledge and actuality, I can claim true expertise only in certain narrow areas. Judaism is deliciously massive. I will, however, rhetorically, over and over, set up a commonly held misconception, only to then show how wrong the misconception is. I will also seek to challenge thoughts and images that have been set in stone regarding our religious traditions. Cognitively, it is nearly impossible to get rid of an image once it has been carved into the stone tablets of our imaginations and beliefs. The only way to challenge these at times is to shock via problematizing the knowledge that we hold. This will on occasion raise defenses. It will not always be pleasant. It is also the only way I know to get us to stare at the burning bush long enough to actually notice that it is burning without being consumed. I accept this all from within the bedrock Jewish concept that we are allowed to debate nearly everyone and everything, and that some moments call for a rhetorical stick, while other blessed moments ask us to stand on one foot and be gracious. My words are always meant as a gateway rather than the end of the road, and the reader always has the freedom to choose how or even if to enter the gateway. And please, rest assured knowing how aware I am regarding what I personally don't know, upon whose shoulders I stand, and how much of the work of challenging my own preconceptions I still need to do. The sages of Rabbinic Judaism offer the dictum, Dibra Torah k'lashon bnei Adam, Torah speaks to us in the everyday and understandable language of humankind. As we try to understand the revelation that step by leap, by hop, by sidle led to what we have today, each individual step required both conscious choice by the writers and inspiration from the leaders whose voice shaped the faith of Am Yisrael. In attempting to describe this sacred process of human receiving revelation, it is probably more accurate than the traditional formulations of Torah to write something like, Moses entered the tent and sunk into a deep contemplative trance. As his eyes closed, he meditated on the challenges of the day, the difficulties the arguing factions around him experienced as they tried to find a way forward in the wilderness of the unknown that they faced. With all the knowledge, wisdom, and especially the intuition and active dreaming life that made him the ideal leader for this time, a pattern of possibility started taking shape in his mind. But that takes a lot of words. And at some level of relating to the power of trances and the transformative nature of directed intuition, our ancestors instead chose a more visceral shorthand, especially useful for the times that gave rise to this new narrative experiment. Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, and the Eternal spoke to Moses, saying. We rely on the comfortable and known formulation, and in the narrative it works. It flows, it feels right. But we are only able to evolve in our own relationship with that which is greater than us. when we slowly seek to internalize the more complex history that lies behind the punchy version. These books attempt to tell the story behind the pithy phrases and memorable moments of the final text, the motion from creative humanity to world-shaping narrative, and the implications for us as religious beings, whether we want to be religious or not. Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that. I look forward to hearing your comments after you have read this book. Take care. We'll see you next time. Adonai Echad.